This slideshow will focus on some of the people that settled the American West, the people going out to mine for precious minerals, and the people out ranching cattle. So at this point in history, America had kind of changed. They had changed over the course of the Civil War from a farming nation that was all about farming and growing crops and whatever else, to an industrial nation that was making products. And so what happened with that is the demand for these minerals increased. These minerals that are found in the ground, that are mined out of the ground, that demand increased a lot because it was needed in those factories to create the goods that they needed to create, as well as the need for gold or the desire for gold and silver and all that kind of stuff. So, the other thing that this industrial nation thing did, is it led to the building of a bunch of railroads out to the west so that they could connect those mines that are out in the west to the factories back east. And so it allowed transportation to be much easier and the country to become kind of smaller, if you think of it that way. You can move a lot faster around it, so it's less difficult to get from one place to another. So one of these people was Henry Comstock. He was one of the prospectors out there looking for minerals, and he bought some land near Virginia City, Nevada. He had bought this land, and some other people found a really rich source of minerals, of gold especially, nearby, really close. And so Comstock claimed that he owned this land, and quickly struck a deal with them. He said, "I will share the money that we get out of it, but I'm gonna strike a deal with you guys, and we'll both share the claim to this gold." But then they started to mine it. They started to try and figure it out, and they couldn't do it. All the machinery, all of everything they had was getting all mucked up with this nasty clayish blue mud that they couldn't figure out, and so they were just tired of trying to mine it over and over again, and so he decided to sell it off. And so he sold it off for a few $1,000s. But what that mud turned out to be, that blue mud, was actually silver, almost pure silver, pure silver ore that was worth millions of dollars. So he sold his millions of dollars worth of silver for a few $1,000s. But this big catch, this big amount of stuff that he found, this rich mineral area, had people rushing out to the area to try to find more. So people rushed to Virginia City and into Nevada. Virginia City was in Nevada, and Nevada quickly became the 36th state. This town of Virginia City, which was about 100 people, a few hundred people, grew to about 30,000 in just a few months. It had an opera house and furniture shops and fashion from Europe and newspapers and a six-story hotel. It turned from this small town into a big city based off this uh, mining hit. So this kind of area that goes from lower population to instantly being a big city very, very quickly was known as a boom town. And a boom town is just a town with rapid economic growth, and it becomes very big very quickly. It's named after a boom, which is, a time of really, really fast growth in the economy. So these towns were kind of moving through, but prospectors were fighting over land and couldn't decide whose was whose, and there would be criminals and thieves and stuff like that. And so, in order to keep some law and order, a lot of these towns turned to vigilance committees, and vigilance committees were just a group of volunteers, and they volunteered and they said, "We'll hunt down and punish any criminals." And really, you would think that some of them went out and just punished very severely when at it, but most of these vigilance committees were actually pretty fair, and they tried to deal with the issues firmly and fix them, but they were also tried to do it as fairly as possible. So that's the vigilance committees. Now, eventually, like anything, the mines ran out. Okay, and when the mines ran out of minerals, the town shrank back down very quickly and get very, very small. like in the instance of Virginia City that we talked about last slide, that went from a few hundred up to 30,000 quickly. It quickly went back down and ended up at about 500 in 1930, and so it went down really really quickly. But still, other cities were completely abandoned, and those are ghost towns that are towns where everybody just kind of ups and leaves, and it's just sitting there without any people in it. The towns, and some of them still stand today, that were just completely abandoned by the people. And so these boom towns were happening, and these mining strikes were happening, and so it was leading to a lot of states being created. One of which that we're going to talk about was a lot of growth in Colorado. In Colorado, a bunch of people ran out there, rushed out there quickly to the Pikes Peak region that we talked about earlier, in those Rocky Mountains, and they were trying to pan for gold, but most of them failed and headed home. They called it the Pikes Peak hoax. All right, they thought, well, there's no gold here. We all thought there was going to be, but there wasn't, and this is just kind of a bummer, and so they left. Um, sad and empty-handed. So it didn't grow right away. Now there was a whole lot of gold there, but it was way below the surface. It was hard to detect and hard to get out, and so they just didn't know about it. But in Leadville, Colorado, they found deep, deep deposits of lead and silver, so a whole lot of lead and silver, found it in the 1870s. A bunch of people rushed in, and Leadville became one of the West's most famous boom towns of all of the different boom towns. Another thing that was really important about Leadville was because it had this major deposit and became this big city and this important city, railroads were built to it. So the railroads began to be built through the Rocky Mountains, through Denver, and that's what created Denver being kind of a major city. And of course, more mining finds led to more states being created. And so we'll start with just a couple of them. In the Dakota Territory, up in the Black Hills, there was gold found. And so that was very quickly populated. A lot of people ran out to that area and started to fill it up. In the Montana area, there was also a bunch of copper. And so with these places kind of having cities nearby, and being more populated, farmers and ranchers started to come out on the railroads, and they came in to settle the area. So instead of just coming in and trying to take the minerals out, they came to actually live in this area and set up their own farms and ranches and things like that. And so they grew very, very quickly. And by 1889, there were three new states: North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. Also in Arizona, there was kind of a similar pattern where they found these deep deposits of copper, one of the country's largest copper deposits in the 1860s and the 1870s. And so people started to kind of move their way down to Arizona to try and find more minerals. And eventually in Tombstone, Arizona in 1877, there was a lot of silver found. And so this set off another boom. A whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of prospectors came down into the territory to try to find more of these minerals. This boom wasn't quite as fast as the ones in like Colorado or Nevada or Montana. It was slower, and it took a good amount of time, and so it took about 30 years. And so this boom, this town was kind of growing along the whole time, and there's a bunch of these prospectors and people like that. There were a lot of outlaws that were out there trying to rob people of money and do things like that, and gunfights between those famous outlaws, and the sheriffs there, Marshal Wyatt Earp and his brothers. So though that's known as the gunfight, as the OK Corral, and there's a lot of different like movies and stuff made surrounding that. But by 1912, right, those 30 years later, Arizona and New Mexico both had enough people to apply to become a state. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 1. So at the same time as this is happening, mining technology is starting to advance. So it was really difficult to take these minerals and get them out of these mountains in the west, and they had to figure out better ways as they're moving through. In the beginning, they started with these kind of shallow deposits. So they'd find the places that were really close to the top of the ground, and they would do something called placer mining, where they would take those shallow deposits and dig them out with picks and shovels, just hand tools. And then they changed to a tactic or a strategy called sluice mining. Okay, sluice mining is the second one there, and I guess I could circle as I'm going here. Sluice mining said that, or what they did is instead of panning, you going through the water, digging it up, trying to pan out the sediment and wash it off in the river, whatever. Okay, they would just divert large amounts of the river water into a trench with screens, and that river water would flow over all of the dirt and sediment and all that kind of stuff, and it would allow the sediment and dirt to wash out of there, but keep the minerals in that screen. So it was just a much faster method of going through the dirt and stuff, and taking out the bad stuff and keeping the valuable stuff around. And then it changed to a much more efficient method, but I would argue not a very good method, called hydraulic mining. And this is a picture of hydraulic mining right up here. Hydraulic mining is just spraying really high pressure water at the hill or mountain that you're trying to mine to get the dirt and gravel. So you're just knocking all of the dirt and all of the gravel off and just leaving the minerals behind. And so you're just hoping to wash away enough of the dirt that you can see gold or see silver or copper or whatever else. The hydraulic mining was fast. It was efficient. You'd be able to go a little bit deeper, but there were a lot of environmental issues with it. All of the sediment, all the dirt and everything, you'd wash it off with water, and where would it go? It would go straight into the river. The river would fill up with sediment, and it would flood the entire areas that were being dealt with, and it would ruin the land. It would ruin the areas that the farmers were trying to farm. So farmers started to sue, and they eventually won an injunction to stop hydraulic mining. Congress put forth an injunction to stop hydraulic mining. Hydraulic mining was allowed again in 1893, but at that point, most of the companies had moved on to the kind of mines we know now, where they're kind of down in the tunnels, deep in pits and stuff like that, mining, kind of like the way that you think of mining. Ranching played another big part in the settlement of the American West. Ranching, when you think about that, is keeping livestock, right? And so what we're talking about here is cattle ranching, so cows. So there were 5 million Texas Longhorn cattle roaming the Great Plains. They lived really well out there. They descended from a Spanish breed that had come over with the Spanish, and they were just doing really well with not very much water, the tough prairie grasses, but they could survive where a lot of other animals couldn't. So about 5 million are out there roaming the Great Plains, and people came to herd them. They came to bring them together into a group, care for them, and harvest them. So what is harvest? Harvest means you're going to kill and eat them, right? And so they brought them together, did that, took care of them, and harvested them. And where did they do this? They did this on something called the open range. The open range was this massive grassland that the federal government owned, right? And in this area where the open range was, you could let your cattle eat the grass, whatever, for free. You didn't have to pay anything, and there was no restrictions on the property. You didn't have to worry if it was your property or your neighbor's property or whatever. Okay, any cows could be on there, and they could all be eating and just kind of hanging out. So, there was all of these cows out there, 5 million of them. They're all over the place, and nobody ever went out and got them before. And the reason nobody went out and got them before is because there wasn't really a high demand for it. The beef prices were low, so you couldn't get very much money for them, and it was really, really hard to get all those cows and bring them back out to the east. There just wasn't the opportunity. But as railroads came in, there became new opportunities to come in or to bring those cattle and make it happen a whole lot easier. And so that was important. But also a bunch of in the Civil War, a lot of the cows that lived out in the east that were part of these farms had been killed and fed to soldiers to keep them alive, and so beef prices had gone way up too. So beef was now at a higher price, and it was easier to use that railroad to ship them to the east. So people started to round them up, and these people were called cowboys, right? And these cowboys drove about 260,000 longhorns to Sedalia, Missouri, in the first what's called the long drive. So you would get them all together and move them, kind of like almost like think of a stampede, but like a controlled stampede from one place to another. And other cattle trails started to open up all across the West as those longhorn steers were kind of brought out of the open range and harvested consistently by these people. So you empty those 5 million cattle that are just kind of hanging out there for free. And as quickly as it began, the open range also ended very quickly. It was not a long period of time to have these cowboys doing this. Hundreds of square miles of land were bought, and then of the open range, and they were fenced in. Okay, and the way that they were fenced in before that was really hard and a lot of work and expensive to try to create a fence. But there was a new invention called barbed wire, and barbed wire is simply just these giant rolls of wire that had these barbs on them, right? So they're sharp and pointy or whatever, and you could make a fence on them. You just go from one post to the next, string it out there, and then the cattle would bump up against it. It would hurt them, and they wouldn't want to go that way, so they'd be happy to stay within the fence. So this invention of barbed wire made all of this land where people could roam free and cows could roam free into little pieces of land that were fenced off and owned by individual ranchers. In the Southwest was a little bit different because they had many of those Mexican settlers. So after the Mexican-American War, the residents, the people that were Mexican that lived in this area, were allowed to stay. So part of the agreement was that they could stay, they could keep their land, and they would become American citizens. And most of it was these people in these huge farms called haciendas. All right, and so those people kept the power for a long time until the boom started to happen and people started to move out there. And so in California, which was one of the areas that was Mexican before, the 49ers came out in 1849. That's why they're called the 49ers. And this was during the gold rush. So the people that came out were known as the 49ers. And the population of California grew from 14,000 to 100,000. And so those Hispanic Californians that were living there that were less than 14,000 were eventually flooded out by tons of Americans and outnumbered. And so they really didn't have much power left in their land. And so the Hispanic people they started off with equal power, but eventually the discrimination against them that was happening by the Americans that came out started to lower down their status. And honestly, it was to the point where land was illegally taken from some of these large farm owners that was actually their land was taken away by prospectors and ranchers and people that were coming in. It was kind of interesting. These Spanish people, vaqueros, they were the ones that taught the cowboys that we talked about before, taught these Americans how to manage the cattle, how to rope them, how to do all of these different things. And so they were actually being quite helpful to them and kind of fueling one of the big economic uh, portions of this area completely. And so there was some fighting in some areas that happened between the Hispanics and the Americans in small areas. There was a group of New Mexicans in New Mexico, New Mexicans called the Whitecaps that raided ranches owned by English speakers and would tear down their fences, burn their barns, burn their houses, do different things. And so the federal troops were tried to they tried to call the federal troops in to stop the raids. The president did not send anybody, but the raids did finally end in about 1891. So, even though in New Mexico there were a bunch of English-speaking settlers coming in, there were still, that was an area where Hispanic people held a lot of their influence and were able to maintain a lot of their power. And so the other thing that happened is as these railroads were coming in and there was more access to trade and more access to economic opportunity, a lot of Mexicans started to move into the area and create these Spanish communities inside of America that they called barrios. And yeah, they built these different communities these communities that were basically all Spanish people, Mexican people, and they built them because they had that opportunity based on the economics of the railroads. Take a moment to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any, then create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.